Okay, so like the other flute videos that we've made, hardwood flutes in, we're basically going to put some of my favorite glue. Wish I had these guys as a sponsor. This is good stuff. I've used all kinds of glue, and it's not that I dislike others, but when you've done something the same way for 20 or more years, you start believing that it's reliable. Hopefully that doesn't jinx me. Every time I say that about something, the company goes and changes however it was. But anyway, so what we've got here is a little bit of glue on each side. It's especially important to do this with a drone flute, whereas I may have done it briefly on my my other flute videos. By the way, this glue is non-toxic, which is good. Otherwise I wouldn't be rubbing it with my fingers. Little word of warning there. Make sure you follow the instructions on the glue bottle. They're there for a reason. But it's very important that we thoroughly cover the mating surfaces of the wood. Otherwise, with a drone flute, like I say, you know, you don't want to have a little bit of air escaping out of this area internally in the flute. You'll be kicking yourself wondering why it's not playing. One side plays great, but the other side just won't play. Or for some reason they both won't play, or something like that. You just got to make sure you do anything you can in advance to stop this kind of thing from happening. So, most important thing is not the outside of the flute. Honestly, these chambers here lining up is not as important as these chambers here lining up. Very, very critical. So we're going to make sure that they go in there just right, which is almost exactly with my holes there. And the first place that I always like to put a clamp, no matter what kind of flute I'm making, if it's made out of hardwood, and of course I've split it because traditionally people didn't drill flutes out. If it's working for you right now and you're drilling them out, more power to you. But it's not the way I do it, for a lot of reasons. So the first thing I do is I like to put a clamp in between the supply hole and the sound holes of the flute. And then I usually put one down at the other end because it's the furthest from this area. And then I like to put one on the top up here. Of course, being certain that these things are lined up straight. And if you notice, by looking at the bottom of the flute, they look pretty dang lined up. This little piece of scar tissue may throw you off a bit here, but the circles inside look pretty good. It looks like we may need to move it down just a little bit. You can hear my friends talking in the video there. Little cardinals. They love to come in my flute videos. There we go. How about that? Lined it right up. Go just a little bit more there. There we go. So it looks like we're pretty lined up. Rest assured we're going to take care of any straightness issues in a moment too, with some nice sandpaper on the end of a rod. So it is important when you're making a drone flute that you clamp not only the sides of the flute, as you'll notice by this thing having so many clamps on it in just a moment, clamp the sides like we do on the other flute videos, but also you need to clamp it in the middle as well. If you don't clamp it in the middle, there is a possibility you'll have some air leakage, and that is not a pretty thing. Not easy to fix on a drone flute, unless you either take it apart and put it back together, or know exactly where the leak is and fix it internally, which isn't fun. So we got clamps on the sides, as well as in the middle. We could count them, but I know that there's probably like, let's see, I think I've got about 8 on it right now. 9? Yeah, maybe 9. Soon to be 10, probably 12 clamps. Back in my youth, I used to use no less than 24 clamps on one flute. Some people would say, well, why would you do that? And the reason I would do it is because it erased any signs of there being a seam on the side of the flute. even if you used two completely dissimilar woods, you still wouldn't be able to see the seam unless there's a major coloration difference there. So we look good here. We look good on this seam. Let's see what the other seam looks like on the other side. Wow, this thing weighs a ton now. Seam looks pretty good except for right here. I don't know if you can see that, but there's a little dark line right there, which means that it's got some possibility of air escaping. So I'm going to grab one more of my clamps. Kind of run out of flute clamps for now. I've got some on some other items. I'm going to use one of my giant box clamps. This sucker here is huge. We use it for making cedar boxes. But sometimes you got to do what you got to do. There we go. You see that glue squirt out of it right then? Right there. That means that there's a nice seal inside. Without that seal, you might be regretting it later on. And remember, don't clamp too tight, because if you clamp the wood too tight, it'll crack. But, let's see one more place I might want to put a clamp. We're going to let this one dry for a few minutes. And after we let it dry, we're going to plane it. But in the meantime, I think I'm going to show you how I'm going to plane the other one, how I'm going to get the surface of the flute to look and play the way I need it to, because I've got one that I glued yesterday and it's ready. Okay, so we're going to go to a different location here and see what that one looks like. So this is the one that we had the piece fly off yesterday when I mentioned my flute foo. A little joke. This piece right here actually flung off and jumped off in the middle of nowhere, and it didn't finish routing it either, so I had to go back and resurface it with a Dremel, but really you can't tell right now, and we're only going to wind up using maybe the very tip of it, and you won't see that it's been broken either. That's if it doesn't fly off in my planer. Planer is really a great tool and a nice way to surface your drones. And this little surface planer here is going to help us make really quick work of it. One thing that you want to keep in mind if you're using a planer to surface your drone is not only any knot holes or cracks that it might have, because those pieces are going to go in my collection bag, but you want to keep in mind how thick this is and what the depth of the flute is inside. I'll show you in just a second. Let's go ahead and plane some of it off first. Okay, just turn this thing off for a second so I can show you what we've done so far. And if you've noticed, it's I guess between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch thick, probably about 1/8 of an inch thick wall between the interior of the flute and the exterior of the flute top here, and likewise on the side. The next thing we're going to do is try to trim it down and clean off this excess surface material on the side of the flute. So you got some glue coming out there. And once again, this is the trickiest part, hoping that this crack stays in place, this piece that I put back on. It's always best to send the knot holes through first. If you send them out through last, it will definitely fling them off. And it's always best too to use it just a little bit at the time. Like if you normally run a board through and take off a 1/16 of an inch, you might want to do a 1/64 of an inch when you've got a knot hole there. kind of habitually keep my planer cranked down so nobody sticks their hand in it, even though I leave it unplugged. That's a way to do it. Okay, so let's take a look at this thing with my caliper up close and personal here. And you can see that I've got 5 millimeters. That's just a little bit more than 1/8, which is perfect because I'm going to be sanding it some more after this. And it's 5 over here. It's actually 6 millimeters over here. 5.5, I'm sorry. And then perfect 5, perfect 5. And the next thing we're going to do is kind of shape this area and sand this down. I won't bore you with you having to watch that unless you like to listen to good music. So. Okay, I'm going to change the sanding belt out. This is a big coarse 50 grit that I use mostly for shaping. Go to an 80 here. One little word of advice that I'll tell you is don't dig in too much up here unless you know exactly where your air chamber is. If you do, you wind up with a really thin spot on the side and it won't be pretty. Okay, time to change sandpaper again. This here's 120 grit. One of my favorite sandpapers too. It's only got a couple of competitors. It's not a 3M company like what I've been pretty much using most of my life. It's a some kind of Swedish company called Diablo. I get it from Home Depot just to show you the difference in the two papers. This is one from Lowe's that's a ceramic coated sandpaper, and this is a oh gosh, zirconium paper, I think is what it is. The thing I like, the difference between the two, is these guys have the best sandpaper adhesive. The glue that they use to put the grit on the paper is fantastic. This paper here is some sturdy paper. This belt will stretch out before it actually wears out. This belt will wear out before it actually stretches out. And by stretching, I mean it will seem like this thing just can't dig in anymore, and I can actually hold my hand on it and the sander will keep spinning, whereas this one won't do that. You can see it's very springy. So they both have their ups and downs. Honestly, I like both of them for what they're good for, but for cutting fast, this has been my favorite for a while anyway. I'm gonna give those guys more of a try, because this is really the first one. I mean, they just come out not more than a couple of months ago. In case you've never seen one of these, this is a big eraser. It's designed to take the sawdust off of your sandpaper. Fine sandpaper gets clogged up a lot, but good sandpaper, you can go back and clean it and use it and clean it and use it and clean it and use it for a long time. This belt that's on here is only 120 grit, but as I'm using it on a sander, it comes out to be a lot finer than that. Mostly because it's probably smearing the grain together, the texture of the wood. Not really either here nor there. Just the pros and cons of doing all this by hand or doing it with a sander. I will be finishing it by hand, of course. Okay, so not too shabby, kind of pretty, mostly rounded on the sides, fingerings feel good. You always want to check and see what it feels like, you know. One little piece here that we want to concern ourselves with is the spacing between this hole and the side of the flute where it starts to taper down from our sanding. You don't want it to taper down within the hole itself, so you want a nice flat surface there. If you find that it is tapering down, you can go back and sand it some more if you have room to do so. I mean, because I'm going to be burning this track area out in just a second, and you might mess up some of that. So you got to be mindful of some of these things in advance. But that track area is what we're going to work on next, which you'll get to see, and we'll explore that in just a moment.